In many respects, 2024 was the kind of year which makes wishing anyone a happy 2025 seem like a reckless temptation of the fates. Nevertheless, as a planet, a species, and a foreign affairs podcast, we find ourselves contemplating with both trepidation and optimism another as yet unwritten chapter in our history books. We do know that early in the new year a new US president will be sworn in, and because this new US president is also a previous US president, we have some form on which to bet. It would be surprising, all things considered, if the second inauguration of Donald Trump does not prove to be the event which has most to do with how 2025 pans out. We know that President-elect Trump intends to bring swift ends to the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. We don't yet know what his plans, or indeed concepts of plans, are or if they will work. If a restrained Russia or a placid Middle East could be accomplished by US presidents wishing for them, we would barely have heard a squeak out of either since Harry Truman was in the White House. We can probably wearily expect an amount of self-indulgent tail-chasing among Europe's alleged leading nations. Germany will hold early elections, which may cause at least as many problems as they solve. France may have to hunt again for a prime minister who will outlast any given baguette. Into that void may step, who knows, a confident Italy, an assertive Poland, a UK which may be coming to understand that though you may check out of Europe, you can never really leave. And that's just the stuff we know about. What else should we look out for in 2025? What should we not overlook? And how hopeful does our panel dare be? This is the Foreign Desk.
You know, when they say that, look, without China, no peace is possible in Ukraine because China can only rein in Russia and so on and so forth. But that in turn means that China will have a say about what Russia can do or cannot do in Europe.
Who can talk to Trump? Is it going to be von der Leyen? She had a very good relationship with Biden. And if it's not her, is it Meloni? And what does that deliver for wider Europe?
And we have another factor, which is Netanyahu's corruption trial. When many of us said that a defendant in a corruption trial shouldn't run a country, in our worst nightmare we didn't think on this scenario. And he will do anything, including prolonging the war in Gaza, in order to stay in power.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. We begin with Gabrielius Landsbergis, outgoing Foreign Minister of Lithuania. We met with Landsbergis at the Lithuanian Embassy in London during his last week in the job. I began by asking about the restoration of Donald Trump to the White House and whether Trump actually could force a settlement of the war in Ukraine, as he claims.
Yeah, he can, I think. When you know, couple of things why I think that way. First of all, is practical strength of United States. Definitely, they have a power, and EU has it as well, but just way more difficult to use it. They have a power to put Ukraine in a very strong negotiation position, and then the mandate. That means that politically, Donald Trump has a very strong mandate to do what he told that he can do. He has support of the Senate, he has the support of Congress, and I think that he would be able to convince American people that this is the right thing to do. So he has what it takes. I can sense that. Whether he will, that's a different question.
Do you see risks attached to that, though? Because there is a conventional wisdom, and it's an argument you've made yourself over the last 3 years, that appeasing the aggressor does not work out in the long run. They never are happy with what they have. They'll always be thinking of the next thing. Yep. And the nightmare scenario that people generally play with, especially with the idea of President Trump being returned, is that Putin bites off a chunk of one of the Baltic states and then waits to see how serious everybody is. Do you think that risk is elevated if a settlement is reached in Ukraine?
Look, I mean, again, going back to my previous point, is that if Ukraine is not put in a stronger position, but forced to negotiate from a weaker position, then it is appeasement and capitulation, right? Because then why would Putin then change any of his goals? Why he would remove anything from the table? And
do you think the former Soviet Union remains his ultimate goal, that he wants it all back?
I can say this with quite a big level of certainty, that if negotiations were to start where Ukraine is in a weaker position, Putin will have asks that will directly implicate changes on the Baltic security and, well, Eastern flank security. Honestly, in 2021, Lavrov clearly said what is his expectation. Is a NATO's return to 1997, arrangement. Not necessarily borders, but arrangement. An arrangement, what does it mean? That, for example, there have to be limitations on how many NATO troops can be placed on the Eastern flank countries. And it gives then an idea that, okay, so should the current level of support that we are getting in the Baltics, should it remain? Imagine us getting a question. Do you want peace in Ukraine? And is getting rid of troops from your countries is not a good price to pay for Ukrainian peace settlement? And then, basically, Putin has a hand already, not just in Ukraine's pocket, but in NATO's pocket. And this is a huge problem. And it all starts on the battlefield and how strong Ukraine is entering the negotiations.
Do you think that Europe has to think about it being this way forever, though, not just necessarily for the year we're looking ahead to, but for the foreseeable future, that there is no prospect of a relationship with Russia that isn't essentially adversarial? I mean, I think that the dream scenario, which I think we've talked about before, is maybe one day the Baltic states could have the same kind of relationship with Russia that Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg do with Germany.
Well, it depends on the horizon. We have to agree on what are you talking about. I've had friends in EU. Whenever we talk about any arrangements, their horizon is a couple of years, where they would say, "Oh, look, we have to think about our future with Russia," and my argument is, no, we have to think our future from Russia. That means that we have to kind of consider how will we be defending ourselves, right? How will we be strengthening NATO, building up defenses, securing borders, buying more tanks and strengthening our armies and stuff like that. This is the arrangement that Baltics would see going forward. But if your horizon is 50 years, 100 years, well, then anything is possible.
We should also talk, and it's a similar conundrum, I guess, about China, which you have been, as foreign minister, very outspoken about, and you have steered Lithuania towards a much harder line than most European countries. Lithuania, I know, on your watch has recently thrown out some more Chinese diplomats. But do you worry that Europe is making the same kind of mistake with China that it did with Russia? That if we embrace them in a mutually beneficial economic relationship, then that will lessen the chances of any conflict?
I think we're already there.
You think we've already made that mistake?
Yeah, I think that we've already made that mistake. I think that we're on the verge of making another one. If I may.
Which other one are we making?
I think that there are people who are inviting China into a security arrangement in Europe. When people would say, look, China can help us solve war in Ukraine. So basically this is the, invitation. If, again, sorry, to sound dramatic, but if there would happen a Munich agreement, which I'm not entirely convinced that it won't happen, there are people who think that China should be sitting at that table. When they say that, look, without China, no peace is possible in Ukraine because China can only rein in Russia and so on and so forth. But that in turn means that China will have a say about what Russia can do or cannot do in Europe. It's not just Europeans, it's not transatlantic society, but it's actually inviting China in, and I think that's a horrible mistake to make.
What do you attribute the willingness to make that mistake to, though? Are people just naive? Are they just determined to find any solution that isn't conflict? Because obviously nobody wants a conflict with China, just as nobody actually wants one with Russia.
Well, if I were to look out, I think it's just definitely not geopolitical. I think it has to do with what is called a social contract, right? So we are at the stage where we either have to tell our people, the publics, that we have to spend more in defense if we want to get back on a geopolitical track and be, a continent that is able to defend itself, able to assist those outside our, immediate area, which, the countries that need help, such as, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, whatever, that from getting from 2% to 2.5% in the foreseeable future won't just cut it. We actually have to talk about the things that, the Poles are talking, that Balts are talking, where in Lithuania we are, 3.2, 3.4%, Poles are, 4.7%?
Heading for 5%.
Yeah, heading for 5%. This is the numbers that continent has to be talking about. So imagine the conversation that needs to happen in our countries, where you have to say, look, we have to spend tens of billions of euros, of pounds and dollars on defense because we are on a weaker foot, way weaker foot, and so in order not to have that debate, we will have any other conversation, just not to have that one. So this is where our invitation to China comes from, because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to invite China to secure peace in Ukraine rather than us convincing our population that we have to put tens of billions of pounds at the table in order for us to get strength we need, in us to get the ability to support Ukraine that Ukraine needs. That is, I think, where it's coming from.
And just finally, because we do like to embark on our New Year's show with some amount of optimism, and you are right that the world is not necessarily getting any calmer and that there are, as we have been discussing, any number of things we will have to worry about over the next 12 months. But if you've got yourself one hope, one sort of sliver of optimism that you're clinging to, what would you like to see be noticeably better this time next year?
Well, there is a chance that Ukraine will be in stronger position. There is a chance that Europe would find its strength. And I'm not saying just because I hope so, but there is an actual way towards it. There are elections in some important capitals and in Europe where we might see different attitude, I would say, forming. That would provide a push for Europe to get more cohesive, to get its strength together. This is where I would be looking forward, to some optimism. It might be shattered, obviously, but hopefully not, because there are so many people who do understand that this is needed. It's so unfortunate when we're seeing, and I'm seeing as a EU person, a continent of 27 countries that have a union of 450 million people and unable to show the strength for it, and where it clearly has an ability. So this is where my hope lies.
That was Gabrielius Landsbergis, former Foreign Minister of Lithuania, speaking to us at the Lithuanian Embassy in London. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller, and joining me now for a look ahead to 2025 are Yossi Mekelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, Latika Bourke, Writer-at-Large for Australian publication The Nightly, and Charles Hecker, Political Risk Analyst and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Hello and Happy New Year to all of you.
Happy New Year.
Thank you, Andrew.
Happy New Year.
And I guess what we're going to do now is try and figure out how happy a new year it's going to be for the planet at large. At which point, Charles, we do need to start with you, because one thing we do know for sure is going to happen on January 20th, the return of the Donald Trump administration, the return of MAGA to the White House. What do you expect from the first few months?
Back and badder than ever. The first thing I want to say is that the prediction industry is a losing game. And having said that, though, here come the predictions.
Yeah, are you saying that you don't wish to be held accountable for any of what you're about to say 12 months from now?
Hit the erase button immediately after broadcast. But Donald Trump has told us what to expect, not just in the first months of his presidency, but he's told us what to expect in the first day of his presidency, and that is that he has promised to be a dictator, but only a dictator for 24 hours. So we'll see how much self-control he has. History shows that he has none. If he can withhold his dictatorial tendencies beyond the first day of his presidency, I think that what he's actually going to do from the podium, from the steps of Capitol Hill, is that on January 20th, he will declare the release of the January 6th protesters who were serving prison terms for what they did in 2020. I think if he's going to put tariffs on any country, whether it's Mexico or Canada, the UK, or any country of the European Union or China, he will announce that from the Capitol steps. I think he's going to make a very busy day out of it in the inauguration, and a lot of the things that he's been talking about during the campaign will be unleashed on that very morning.
Latika, we do have some form to guide us where a Donald Trump presidency is concerned, because we've had one. And during the first one, at least, there was a conventional wisdom that maybe it wasn't as disruptive and uproarious as it might have been because of two reasons. One was that, advertently or otherwise, he did kind of surround himself with relative grown-ups, like actually proper people who understood how government worked and who understood, therefore, how to stop him from doing things. And there was also the issue of his own, lackadaisical attention span, basic incompetence, complete inability to focus, and therefore couldn't get anything done even if the option was there. How optimistic should anybody be that either of those two restraints are going to be there this time?
I don't think there will be as many restraints on Donald Trump internally by his own hand or choice, and we can see that already from the picks for his cabinet, for his advisors. There's some very important people that were left out of his cabinet, for example, and I think that in itself says a lot. He has basically employed a bunch of outsiders with very strong ideas to come in and execute what MAGA looks like. How that goes, I think, is really an open question. But I think more what I will be looking at for Trump this year is Donald Trump really a China hawk? I think this is the big question. Domestically, we know he's going to junk all sorts of norms and rig the judiciary as much as he can. But externally, one of the only benefits for having Trump geopolitically is that he just might keep in check these authoritarians that are getting pretty muscular. But what if his understanding of tariffs and his understanding of defence spending limits his ability to think strategically about America's place in the world, and he strikes a grand bargain with Xi very early on in his term that actually leaves us all weaker? That's the dynamic I'll be watching next year.
Well, Charles, let's look at that, because it's not hard to imagine what the parameters of some sort of forced deal would be. Basically, Russia would get to keep what it holds. It's imaginable that some sort of agreement could be created in which it would be a West Germany, East Germany sort of thing. Rump Ukraine would be allowed on a path to accession to the European Union, if not NATO, and the conflict, at least in the short term, would stop. And you can maybe kind of see how that could be sold to Ukraine. You could say, look, it is the West Germany, East Germany thing, and we know how that turned out. You might just have to wait a few decades. And you can see how that could be sold to Russia as well, as in you can now declare your special military operation over. You have expanded Russia's territory. You are basically Catherine the Great. But would that be necessarily a terrible deal to strike?
I was about to say that 2025 is going to be a very, very bad year for Ukraine. The only thing that would be good for Ukraine is if the hostilities stop, because a messy peace is probably better than a messy war. The problem for Ukraine, though, is seeing how they don't suffer for the outcome out of all of this. You know, they won't suffer anymore in terms of loss of life, but they're going to suffer for the loss of 20% of their national territory.
And they would also suffer from the prospect, as Ukraine would have it, that if we let them have this, they will come back, they will rearm, and they will come back and they will have another crack in 10 years.
Well, that's right. Also because the strength and the stability of any security guarantees that Ukraine might be offered in the aftermath of some sort of ceasefire are not very credible at the moment. I don't think there's any way that NATO will be involved in a security guarantee for Ukraine. That is a red line for Putin. He won't agree. And by the way, has very little incentive to agree to anything that's proposed to him at the moment. And Trump will not want to see NATO involved in Ukraine. So, we had Macron earlier in 2024 talk about potentially sending French troops to Ukraine. Do we see that happening, particularly now that he's on his third government?
As of this broadcast, etc.
That's right, because you never know what the coming year will bring in terms of France.
Subject to change.
Well, precisely right. But to close out Ukraine, it would be a relief to a deeply, deeply fatigued nation to stop the bloodshed. Beyond that, Ukraine's not going to win very much more.
On that subject of the necessary, as of this recording, rider, given reference to anything in France, Latika, do we look forward with either trepidation or anticipation to power dynamics within Europe shifting dramatically? Because we know that there will be an election in Germany, which is almost certain to result in a change of chancellor and probably another big populist nationalist surge there as well. I think we can probably assume that Macron's presidency will not be smooth sailing all the way through this year. And in that vacuum, is there space for a country like Italy to take a more assertive role, or more obviously perhaps Poland, which has made its intentions extremely clear in terms of its military build-up and its determination to become a major bulwark, not only for its own protection, but for that of the EU entire?
So I've just returned from a trip to Estonia, and one of the interesting observations put to me there was that you cannot lump Poland in with the way that the Baltics see the security guarantees that are necessary for Ukraine. And let's be clear, the Baltics are of boots on the ground, immediate admission to NATO, et cetera, et cetera. Now, clearly, NATO is not going to happen for Ukraine. But back to Poland, I think this is a very interesting study because last week Macron was in Warsaw with Donald Tusk. Mm-hmm. Tusk poo-poos the idea of boots on the ground as a security guarantee. And the observation put to me when I was in Tallinn was that Poland cares about arming itself and defending Poland, which is something a little bit separate to the idea that the Baltics have, that Ukraine is defending Europe, Ukraine is essentially defending NATO and deserves to be in there. Poland perhaps only cares so much as it sees itself threatened. And I think there is a bit of truth to that. And the other thing I wouldn't want to overstate, or at least I think is a dynamic to be tested in 2025, is the Baltics had a rather good 2 years because they got to say to Western Europe, we told you about Putin. We told you about Nord Stream. You laughed at us, you patronised us, you dismissed us. And guess what? We were right. You were wrong. The Baltics are also incredibly and nobly spending up big on their defence. Nevertheless, I think this year tests whether Western Europe's had just a bit too much of Eastern and Central Europe getting a bit stroppy. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic to watch. But ultimately, it all matters, going back to the Italy point, who can talk to Trump? Is it going to be von der Leyen? She had a very good relationship with Biden. Is she going to have the same relationship with Trump? And if it's not her, is it Meloni? And what does that deliver for wider Europe?
Well, Yossi, let's do the really fun part now of predicting what's going to happen in the Middle East in 2025. As of this recording, there is some talk that there is some sort of ceasefire brewing between Israel and Hamas, though we have, of course, heard that before on several previous occasions. But might we reach the point, and this is absolutely not meant to sound in any way glib or in any way not cognizant of what has been wreaked upon the people of Gaza these last year and a bit, Israel's going to run out of targets.
The sad thing is there are always targets if you want to continue a war. And the same goes for Lebanon. They could have continued this. We saw in Afghanistan, in Iraq, because it just changed the nature of the war in Gaza, turned into guerrilla warfare. It doesn't mean it should continue, because the ceasefire is long overdue. It should have taken place 10, 11 months ago. And for mainly domestic political reasons in Israel and some within Hamas, it hasn't happened yet. Now, we can be a little bit more hopeful now because we see some progress. But the price paid by the people in Gaza is enormous. The devastation, everyone that I hear that been to Gaza tell that there is basically, it's completely destroyed. And talk about 45,000 people killed, we don't know how many people are under the rubble, let alone the trauma, the long-term injuries. Then the issue of the hostages, and we don't know how many of them are still alive. The estimate is less than half of them. And those are alive and more than 400 days in captivity. In what conditions they will come home? What it did to the Palestinian society, what it has done to the Israeli society, which is completely divided and fragmented. So even if there is a ceasefire tomorrow, the reconstruction, not only the physical one, but of the societies, is a huge long-term project that will need much support. And for this, first and foremost, the first thing that needs to be done is change of leadership, because neither leadership is fit for purpose. Is this going to happen? We talked about the election that did take place, but the election that should take place in Israel, but the other one also in Palestine. This is long overdue. Mm-hmm. We are not so sure it's going to take place in 2025.
But just to follow that up, Yossi, is it riotously optimistic to anticipate that at some point in 2025, somebody in a position to make decisions might actually start talking about this is what the future of Gaza is going to be? And I'm not asking for judgment on whether it's going to be good or right or fair. It's just the fact that at the moment we have absolutely no idea. No one's told us what's going to happen.
So I can tell you with some authority, there are a lot of plans out there. Many governments are working on plans, from the security plan to the political one. They are there. It's how you implement it. Where is the political will inside Israel, in Palestine, in the region, and the international community? Is Trump going to make a difference? So all in all, we know what needs to be done. But, end of occupation, self-determination, ensuring that everyone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has the same political, civil, and human rights. So we can look at the different modalities of a two-state solution. It can be a confederation. It can be a border running between two states in the kind of more old-fashioned way. But other governments, leaderships, they are capable of doing that. What we see is exactly the opposite. And we have another factor, which is the Netanyahu's corruption trial. It plays such a significant element. And when many of us said 2 years ago that a defendant in a corruption trial shouldn't run a country, in our worst nightmare, we didn't think on this scenario. We thought about kind of more mundane scenarios. In these scenarios, it's even emphasize even further, he can't and he will do anything, including prolonging the war in Gaza, in order to stay in power, because he has elements within the government, the far right. They want not only to occupy Gaza, but as mad as building settlements in Gaza. They want the annexation of the West Bank. As long as he depended on them and his corruption trial, and he tries to derail it, we are in an almost untenable situation.
We've talked a bit about the things that I'm pretty sure we know we're going to be talking about or thinking about or even worrying about in 2025. But I just want to go around the table quickly, starting with you, Latika, and things that may not seem obvious, or the thing that you in particular will be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, so I think I'll be heading to Australia for a good spell of time early in the new year, and there's going to be an election there. It's not that consequential, but I think it will be an important litmus test, because if the Australian government, which is a centre-left government, loses, which polling suggests it could, that's quite shocking. That would be the first time since the 1930s. Combined with Olaf Scholz's dismal performance in Germany and what we expect to take place there, that leaves me wondering if Jacinda Ardern and Justin Trudeau are the last of left-wing leaders
and again, as of this recording.
Correct. Asterisks, hashtag, whatever. Yes, disclaimer. It leaves me wondering if they're the last custodians of two-term left-wing governments. Because what we are seeing, and certainly here in Britain, you're certainly seeing the conditions for the Labor government potentially being a one-term. Now, it's the start and there's a long time to go, of course. But there's an existential question for the left here about why that is. And I think they have not yet reconciled that the party of the worker no longer represents the worker. The worker has gone populist or centre-right for a long time now. And the progressive, wealthy metropolitan elite are on the left and out of sync with a lot of the working class. So this, for me, is a trend I'll be looking at very closely next year.
Charles.
Can I pick two things?
Go on.
One in my comfort zone, one out of my comfort zone. Starting outside my comfort zone, I think we should be watching for the collapse of the Iranian regime. And I think that has the power to completely transform that part of the world. Imagine what would happen to a place like Dubai when Iran becomes a viable international market. And how that will absolutely transform the dynamics in that part of the world. And also imagine when a sort of wealthy and engaged and mobile Iranian diaspora around the world is motivated to come back. And how transformational that would be, not to mention what it would do for Saudi Arabia, what it would do for Lebanon and Gaza and former Iranian proxies, anyway, et cetera. The other quick thing is if there is a ceasefire and some sort of good, bad, temporary or permanent or otherwise settlement in Ukraine, what do we do about Russia? Do we go back? Do we like Russia again? Do banks want to go back? Do oil companies want to go back? And what are the gymnastics involved in pulling off a move like that?
Yossi.
Yeah, what just said about Iran reminded me of a Farsi saying that Ayatollahs are like Persian rugs. The more you walk on them, the more they go up in value. So I think we should be very careful sometimes with that. That's the way they look at it. I think what I'm worried for next year and what's seen, and goes back to what Latika said, is about democracies. Not only the left wing is about democracies. I think they are so vulnerable at the moment. And with the rise of populism, to a degree to connect it also, whether it's going to be the year of artificial intelligence, how all of this is going to be connected in a way that it weakens democracy and how democracy can fight back in order to save it themselves.
And one more around, because it's a New Year episode. We're trying to be upbeat. We're trying to be optimistic. We are trying to do the whole hope over experience thing. So on that theme of hope, Latika, one thing you would just like to see happen in 2025. You don't necessarily have to be confident that it will. That's not the game. Just something you'd like to see happen.
I would like to see happen the best case scenario for electing Trump, which is a stronger America, an America that refines its leadership role in the world and stares down authoritarian leaders.
Charles.
Andrew, my most sort of lofty hope for the coming year is that all of my streaming services sort of combine into one so that, so that I'm only paying one monthly fee instead of about 12 monthly streaming fees.
See, of those two hopes we now have, I don't know which one's the less realistic.
Or which one brings the greater benefit.
Yeah, there's Latika's sort of measured, reasonable expectation that Donald Trump might be a good thing for the world, and there's your insane utopian delusions about streaming services.
Slightly more realistically, perhaps, my deeper and fonder hope, frankly, is that Europe gets its act together and that we have a stable, strong Europe that stands up to Trump, that East and West Europe, as Latika has suggested, sort of reconcile or work together or balance each other out, and that this middle way between China and the United States somehow becomes an equal partner in global governance.
Okay, I no longer feel like the utopian in the room.
Yossi, a high bar to clear.
Yeah, obviously I would like to join these hopes of my friends and colleagues here, but to be kind of simple, I really would like to see ceasefire in Gaza, to see the end of the immeasurable and suffering of people in Gaza, and to see the hostages back, and again observing what their families suffered over the last 14, 15 months. It's just intolerable. And if this, and to be a bit more utopian on this one, if ceasefire can lead also to genuine peace negotiation for a two-state solution, this would be a great 2025.
Yossi Mekelberg, Latika Bourke, Charles Hecker, Happy New Year to all of you, and thanks for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota, Chris Chermak, and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mullett, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye and Happy New Year.